يا رفيع الشام.
या मोहम्मद मोहम्मद मैं कहती रही.
Iranians put their point of view. There was a white gulf. They were poles apart. But this time it appears that the Americans are willing to consider some of the 10 demands that have been put through by the Iranians. And of course, this is indeed a major development. But there will be some skepticism as to how these talks proceed, whether the two sides will be able to come to some sort of a solution to avoid a conflagration in the Middle East. It was just a few hours before that threat of the United States going for all-out strikes on Iran that the Pakistani military chief as well as the Prime Minister got involved. They requested the United States President to reconsider, and therefore there is this breakthrough. But it will be important to see what kind of progress is actually achieved in these talks in Islamabad.
Kamal Haider in the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Thank you very much for that. Let's now speak to Nida Ibrahim, who's in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, to find out more about the view in Israel, because Israel, of course, is the other party in this conflict, Nida. The Israeli military saying in the last few minutes that it has ceased fire in the campaign against Iran.
Well, according to the Israeli army, they want to separate between the front with Iran and the front with Hezbollah. And that's why we've been noticing from the Israeli military the continuation of the evacuation threats, as well as these attacks targeting Lebanon, according to the Israelis. Now, the Israeli prime minister, he only spoke in English, but not in Hebrew, talking about wanting to separate the two fronts between Lebanon and Iran, pushing for more activities there. As we understood it, the Israelis are not interested in an end of this war with Iran. Folly. They have been talking about expanding their bank of targets, expanding the places they want to attack. And now this is reminding them of a scenario that took place in June 2025, when Trump was the one who announced the cessation of hostilities between the two parties. It's hard for Netanyahu to sell this as a win to his constituents, to sell this as a win to his population, specifically that we're hearing a lot of pushback, a lot of criticism amongst not just military analysts, but also opposition leaders in Israel who are saying that Netanyahu is in a political crisis, that he promised goals that he could not achieve.
And I was going to ask you about that, Nida, how this is playing domestically for Prime Minister Netanyahu and how Israelis view this ceasefire.
Well, they feel that Netanyahu has made a whole campaign of striking the regime, pushing for a revolution in Iran, diminishing the threat of the ballistic missile program, also as well as the nuclear program. But all of that, according to the opposition now, has been null and void, because now they believe that the war goals were not met, that Netanyahu's achievements and boasting of diminishing Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, all of that. We continue to see rockets and missiles being fired from Iran, causing damage, especially when we talk about these cluster munitions, until the very last minute. So it's hard for Netanyahu to sell this as anything close to a win, and the opposition is expected to bank on that to try and lobby for itself for the upcoming elections that we are expecting by the end of this year. But let's keep an eye and see how Netanyahu might sabotage the talks that are happening now, because it is not in his interest that a cessation of hostilities or a de-escalation or an end of the war would be announced.
Nida Ibrahim in Ramallah, thank you very much for that. Well, as you heard there, Israel says Lebanon is not included in the 2-week truce between the US and Iran. The Israeli military has just carried out a strike on the southern Lebanese city of Tyre. This comes after it issued forced evacuation threats for people living there. Israel's attacks and expanding invasion have forced 1.2 million people across Lebanon from their homes. Earlier, an Israeli airstrike killed at least 8 people in the coastal city of Sidon. It came shortly before Pakistan announced the ceasefire with Iran was in effect. Let's bring in Zeina Khodr, who's in Sidon for us. So, Zeina, despite this ceasefire announcement, there have been more Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon. Tell us about what's been happening on the ground.
Yes, the Israeli military carrying out a series of airstrikes in multiple locations across southern Lebanon, despite the announcement of that ceasefire between the United States and Iran, with Israel making clear it believes the Hezbollah-Israel front is not included in this deal. What you see behind me is what used to be a cafe where 8 people were killed in an Israeli strike just a few hours before that ceasefire was announced. This conflict now in its 6th week, the civilian toll continues to rise. It's not clear who was the target in this latest strike. The Israeli army issuing a statement saying that the fighting and its ground offensive in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah will continue. So the army reiterating what Prime Minister Netanyahu said. Hezbollah has so far refrained from launching any rockets across the border or claiming any attack against Israeli troops in southern Lebanon. Since that ceasefire deal was announced, they are expected to make their position clear soon. This is according to a source close to the group. So really there's a lot of uncertainty, even though Iran made it clear since the start of this conflict that the Lebanon and Iran fronts are one, and that in any deal it should involve an end to strikes on Lebanon. Now the biggest question here is, are they going to hammer out some sort of a deal concerning Lebanon in the next 2 weeks during this temporary truce? And who is going to negotiate on behalf of Lebanon? Is it going to be Iran, or is it going to be the Lebanese government, which has banned Hezbollah's military wing?
Some important questions there, no doubt. What is happening, Zeina, with the 1.2 million people who've been displaced during this conflict in Lebanon?
People are struggling. There is immense suffering along the seafront here in the southern city of Sidon, and the situation is similar in Beirut. Some people are sleeping in their cars. Some people are sleeping in tents. The government is not able to house the 1.3 million displaced people. Some of them are in shelters, but only a small portion of them. People have lost their jobs. A lot of people who used to live in southern Lebanon worked in their farms, agriculture. Now they're jobless. For at least 400,000 people forced from their homes in Beirut's southern suburbs. They had their businesses there. And the government is struggling. It's nearly bankrupt. I can tell you when that ceasefire announced, there was a lot of optimism among people that they would be able to return to their homes. We saw some cars make their way to the south only to come back, because we heard those new evacuation orders being issued by the Israeli military telling people not to go south of the Zahrani River, and now with all these airstrikes, so people made their way back. So a lot of uncertainty and a lot of suffering.
Thank you very much, Zeina, for that. That's Al Jazeera's Zeina Khodr reporting there live from Sidon. Now, Donald Trump's threats to bomb Iran were intended to force Tehran to end its effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is a vital waterway. 20% of the world's oil and gas passes through it, making it especially important for Gulf economies. Let's bring in Malik Trainer in Kuwait City for us. Even as this ceasefire was announced, Malik, alerts were going off across the region. Tell us first about the situation this morning after the announcement.
Yeah, that's right, Folly. I mean, in just the last 20 minutes, we heard an explosion here in Kuwait City from an interception. In the last 2 hours, we've heard 3. And we've seen attacks this morning also in Bahrain, where authorities in Bahrain said 2 people were injured and homes were damaged in the El Sitra area due to an interception. In the UAE, also a couple of hours ago, they said that 3 people were injured at the Habshan gas field. They've had to suspend operations due to debris from an interception. Overnight, we heard in Qatar, where you are, 4 people were injured after debris fell in a residential area due to an interception. So, these attacks have been happening this morning, but I think, what we've been talking about throughout this war is that in Iran, they've decentralized their military operations. I think people are hoping that this is just a loose chain in the communication of the military command in Iran, and that this ceasefire will hold. And I think the hope is that there's a diplomatic path. That's what Gulf countries have been calling for the entire time. So all eyes will be on Islamabad to try to de-escalate the situation and try to find a diplomatic path for a long-term solution in the entire region.
And all eyes also, Malik, on the Strait of Hormuz to see what ships Iran allows through in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. The Gulf has been divided in 3 camps. We have Bahrain and the UAE. They've taken a more hawkish stance towards Iran. But we also have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, to a lesser extent Kuwait, that have been calling for diplomacy. They're calling for long-term solutions to this conflict. And you have the Omanians. The Omanians have been critical of the U.S., of the Israeli attacks. They said that they're the ones who initiated this attack. They called those attacks unlawful. The Gulf has said before that and consistently that there needs to be a free flow of their energy supplies to the global market. But I think it's important that for the Omanians, if Iran is able to, charge a toll, they also share that narrow strait with the Iranians. So they can they have a financial incentive if that's the case. But I think the world, President Trump, the entire world, all the markets, the international markets, the Gulf in particular, want to see a free flow of their energy supplies to the global market. And so, throughout this negotiations, I think the Hormuz Strait will be a focal point in the talks in Islamabad.
Thank you very much for that. Malik Trainer reporting there live from Kuwait City. Well, let's now discuss these latest developments further with our diplomatic editor, James Bays, who's here with me in the studio, along with Mohammed Al-Masri, Professor of Media Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And also joining us, Samir Puri, a visiting lecturer in war studies at King's College London. Samir is in Singapore. Gentlemen, thank you all for being with us. Let's start, James, with this 10-point plan that the Iranians put forward that Donald Trump agreed to, apparently, after which a ceasefire was announced a few hours ago. What is in this 10-point plan, and who comes out the strongest after the ceasefire is announced?
Well, what's in the 10-point plan? If you'd asked me 24 hours ago, I would have said this is something that would not be accepted by the US, and that the two sides were a long way apart, because this says that there should be an end to a war against Iran and its axis of resistance around the region, a withdrawal of all US combat forces based in military bases in the region, full compensation to Iran, an end of sanctions to Iran, release of Iranian assets that are held abroad, and putting this all in some international agreement, a UN Security Council resolution, and it sounds like they're asking for a treaty as well. Now, there is no way, in my view, that the US is going to actually accept these 10 points, but it's very, very significant that Donald Trump has looked at these and said, yes, they can be on the agenda for the talks that will take place in Islamabad. Iran has won that. Iran now controls the agenda. They'll have to negotiate based on what Iran wants, rather than the earlier US proposals, the 15 points that the US put forward earlier.
All right, Mohammed Al-Masri, your thoughts about this plan. Donald Trump has said this was not good enough, and yet now he's agreeing for it to be on the table. What do you think changed here?
Well, I think Donald Trump's back was against the wall. I think he was pushed into a corner. He pushed himself into a corner in many ways. The war didn't go according to plan, and that's putting it lightly. It's been pretty disastrous for the United States, politically for Trump and for the Republicans. The MAGA base has been divided. There is a huge economic fallout. The Gulf allies have been angered by this decision to go to war. And I think Trump was looking for an off-ramp. The Iranians had the leverage. They withstood the U.S.'s strongest punch. It was clear that the regime was standing and was going to continue to stand. They had control over the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. could have dug in its heels and went at this for another 2 or 3 months, but there was no indication that the regime was going to fall even then, and it would have come at a huge cost for the United States. So I think Trump was more or less forced into this. And one of the things that's interesting about that post that he put on Truth Social, I don't.
Which one?
Well, I believe it was the first one, but don't quote me on that. But he said at one point in there, and I wish we could put it up on the screen. He said that most of the points have already been agreed to. So he's signaling that this is sort of not a done deal necessarily. Yes, there will still have to be negotiations, but I think the Iranians have significant leverage to get what they want.
Samir Puri, your thoughts? I mean, both sides arguing about who made the concessions, not asking you who's won this phase, these first 6 weeks, but who goes into these talks in Islamabad with the upper hand?
Very hard to say. The US still retains the ability to return to violence. So they have that. But the Iranians have weathered the storm. The interesting thing now with these talks is the US goal of regime change, that was never going to be achieved. Then there was sort of the next goal of regime collapse, also not going to be achieved. And the last concrete goal the US can actually have, political goal from this war that it launched with Israel, is regime coercion. So if Trump is able to walk out from these negotiations, and Vance, if he's indeed the one who represents the US, with any sort of sense that the Iranians have been coerced, that will, I think, be enough because, and I agree with the previous speaker, that Trump is under quite a lot of domestic pressure to make this a short war. But I think in terms of who has the upper hand walking into this, the thing is Trump is evidently not a detailed man. The idea that he has read and digested these 10 points and thought about their implications and thought about how they differ from Iran's starting point, and I don't think so. I think it's more the sentiment that he's had the war part of what he thinks is quite a choreographed several weeks, and he now wants the part where he can sort of pin some sort of victory lapel onto himself and onto the US military.
But will Netanyahu, Samir, allow him to pin? Will Netanyahu allow him to declare that victory? I mean, will the Israelis? There's a history of Israel sabotaging ceasefire talks in the past. Will it be the same again this time, you think?
Well, the clear sticking point emerging from this is Lebanon. And I think there, if Iran really wants to, really hold that position that this ceasefire and eventual end of hostilities must also include Lebanon, that might be the point where Netanyahu breaks ranks with the US. But I think up until that point, I think at the end of the day, Netanyahu has already gotten an enormous amount more than he could have ever imagined 18 months ago, which is a US president and a US military that has gone to war against Iran to this extent, which no previous US presidents have ever been willing to do.
Your thoughts about that, Mohammed Al-Masri? Will Netanyahu break ranks with the US, given that he's, as we heard from Nida, under pressure domestically?
It's certainly possible. I mean, we've been talking all morning about Israel's history of kind of sabotaging peace deals and ceasefires. The problem for Netanyahu is that this is becoming increasingly unpopular in Israel as time goes on. There's a kind of war fatigue at play. Israel's also struggling to a certain extent in Lebanon. It's becoming a kind of war of attrition. Hezbollah clearly still has the ability to inflict casualties. And you had about 2 weeks ago the chief of staff in Israel saying that the Israeli military was stretched too thin. So I don't know to what extent Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be able to, go back and convince his constituents that it's necessary to continue this war in Lebanon. If I have to guess, I would say yes, he will, because that's kind of his MO, and I think that's also his ticket to winning the next election. But it's going to be more difficult at this stage.
All right, let's look ahead now, James, to Islamabad. All eyes on the Pakistani capital and what happens there in the next few days. What do we know about the format of the negotiations? Who is involved in the negotiations on each side? And what lessons from past negotiations can inform our expectations of what happens in Islamabad?
Well, the Iranians feel they were burned twice before. They don't have any trust in this process. That is why Pakistan has to be involved. Remember, before it was the Omanis, and that whole process the Iranians were very unhappy with because there were more negotiations set in the diary, and the Iranians believe that that diplomacy was used as cover for fresh war. So we've got a different team involved this time. The US will be represented by J.D. Vance, we think, the vice president, who's currently in Central Europe in Hungary. He'll be making his way there. And we think the parliamentary speaker of Iran, Ghalibaf, is going to represent the Iranian side. So an upgrade of what we had before. And I think, of course, for J.D. Vance, this is going to be a very difficult job because, like Netanyahu, he has political calculations here. It's not just about peace deals, it's about the political future of these leaders. This is a man who we think wants to be the next president of the United States, who will be getting that pressure from Netanyahu, who has his own elections coming up by the end of October, to be very, very tough with the Iranians. J.D. Vance comes from the part of the Republican Party that embraced Donald Trump's talk of no foreign wars.
So, Samir Puri, your expectations out of Islamabad on Friday, what do you think will happen? What will be on the table? What will be the red lines for each side? And I also wanted to ask you about China's role here.